It was a quiet evening at La Bella Bistro, a high-end restaurant that prided itself on sophistication and exclusivity. The chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the dining room, where wealthy patrons laughed and chatted, their voices blending with the soft hum of classical music playing in the background. The restaurant was a haven for the elite, a place where deals were struck over vintage wines and secrets were exchanged over extravagant meals. But tonight, amidst the polished silverware and sparkling glasses, a storm was brewing, one that would shake the very foundation of this seemingly perfect establishment. At the center of it all was Mr. Bernard Grayson, the restaurant's owner. Bernard was a man who radiated wealth and power, but his charm masked a darker side. Known for his sharp suits and sharper tongue, Bernard ruled his restaurant with an iron fist. To his patrons, he was the perfect host, gracious, attentive, and always ready with a smile. But to his staff, he was a tyrant. Whispers about his harsh treatment and shady business dealings had long circulated among the employees, but no one dared to speak up. After all, Bernard had a knack for making problems and people disappear. That night, as Bernard stood at the bar, swirling a glass of red wine, his eyes narrowed on one of the waitresses. Her name was Mia Carter, a new hire who had been with the restaurant for only a few weeks. Mia was young, soft-spoken, and diligent, but something about her seemed to irk Bernard. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, calm and composed even under pressure. Or maybe it was the quiet confidence in her eyes, a sharp contrast to the submissiveness he demanded from his staff. Whatever it was, Bernard had made it his mission to put her in her place. "Mia," Bernard barked, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. Heads turned as the other waitstaff froze in their tracks, their eyes darting between Mia and their boss. "Yes, Mr. Grayson." Mia responded, her tone polite but steady as she walked over, balancing a tray of desserts. "Is this how you serve my customers?" Bernard sneered, pointing to a minor smudge on one of the plates. "This is unacceptable. Do you think this is some roadside diner?" Mia blinked, clearly taken aback. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll fix it right away." "Sorry." Bernard's voice rose, dripping with mockery. "Sorry doesn't cut it here. Maybe you're not cut out for this kind of work. Maybe you should go back to wherever it is you came from." The room fell silent. Customers glanced over, intrigued by the scene unfolding before them, while the staff exchanged nervous glances. Mia stood there, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but her eyes didn't waver. There was no anger, no fear, just a quiet determination that made Bernard's blood boil. "You know what? Take the rest of the night off," Bernard said coldly. "Clearly, you're not fit to represent my restaurant." Mia nodded, setting down the tray with care. "Of course, Mr. Grayson," she said simply, before turning to leave. As she walked past the tables, Bernard smirked, satisfied with his display of authority. But what he didn't realize was that the woman he had just humiliated wasn't just a waitress. Mia Carter was far from ordinary. In fact, she was an undercover FBI agent. Mia had been assigned to investigate Bernard Grayson after allegations of money laundering, tax evasion, and illegal dealings had surfaced. For weeks, she had meticulously studied him, his routines, and his network, blending seamlessly into the restaurant's staff. Every insult she endured, every demeaning comment, brought her closer to unraveling the truth. And now, as she stepped out into the cool night air, she knew she was closer than ever. Little did Bernard know, his empire of lies was on the verge of collapse. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't just be his reputation at stake, it would be his freedom. But Mia wasn't done yet. There was still one final piece of the puzzle to uncover, and she knew Bernard would slip up eventually. All she had to do was wait. As the camera pans back to Bernard, laughing with a group of wealthy patrons, the screen fades to black, leaving the audience with a burning question. What will happen when Bernard Grayson discovers the truth about Mia? The door to La Bella Bistro swung shut behind Mia, but the sting of Bernard's words still lingered in the air. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she walked down the cobblestone street, the elegant facade of the restaurant glowing softly behind her. She knew moments like this were part of the job, painful, humiliating, but necessary. Bernard had no idea who he was dealing with, and Mia had no intention of letting his cruelty derail her mission. As she reached her car, a nondescript black sedan parked a few blocks away, she slid into the driver's seat and pulled out her phone. A small green light blinked on the dashboard, a discreet recording device she had planted earlier that evening. She pressed a button, and Bernard's voice crackled through the speakers. "Do you think this is some roadside diner?" His tone was sharp, laced with disdain. Mia didn't flinch as she listened back to the recording, her face impassive. Every insult, every degrading comment was another piece of evidence. Mia worked for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a department tasked with uncovering complex white-collar crimes. Bernard Grayson had been on their radar for months, his name surfacing in connection with multiple offshore accounts and suspicious cash flows. On the surface, he was a respected businessman, a community figure who donated generously to charity and hosted galas for the city's elite. But beneath that polished exterior was a man who thrived on exploiting others, from the staff who worked tirelessly in his restaurant to the investors he manipulated to fuel his lavish lifestyle. When Mia first took the assignment, she didn't know what to expect. Undercover work wasn't new to her, but the idea of blending into Bernard's world required a different kind of strategy. She wasn't just observing from a distance, she was living it, enduring the same mistreatment his employees faced, getting a first-hand look at how he ran his empire. Her cover story was simple: a struggling college student in need of extra cash. It was a narrative Bernard would believe without question. He hired her on the spot, barely glancing at her resume. To him, she was just another nameless, faceless employee who could be replaced at a moment's notice. But Mia's anonymity was her greatest asset. It allowed her to move through the restaurant unnoticed, slipping into corners and overhearing conversations Bernard thought were private. Over the past few weeks, she had uncovered more than she expected. Late-night meetings in the private dining room with men in expensive suits. Envelopes exchanged with a quiet nod, their contents carefully shielded from view. And then there were the phone calls. Bernard often disappeared into his office for hours, his voice low but urgent as he spoke in clipped tones. Mia hadn't been able to catch every word, but what she did hear confirmed her suspicions. "Move the funds by Friday," he had said one night, his voice sharp. "I don't care how you do it, just make sure there's no trace." Mia had recorded every word, her hidden devices capturing conversations that would eventually become part of a much larger case. But tonight, Bernard had given her something unexpected, a public display of his cruelty. The way he humiliated her in front of the entire restaurant wasn't just a personal attack. It was a glimpse into how he used his power to belittle and control others. As Mia sat in her car, she replayed the scene in her mind. Bernard's arrogance, the way he relished tearing her down, was his biggest weakness. He thought he was untouchable, that no one would ever dare to challenge him. But Mia wasn't just anyone. She was trained to dismantle men like him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth. She glanced at her phone, scrolling through her notes. Her investigation wasn't just about Bernard's financial crimes. It was about the people he hurt along the way. The waitstaff who endured his temper, the investors who lost everything because they trusted him, the families who suffered while Bernard grew richer. One name stood out on her screen: Luis Morales. A former chef at La Bella Bistro, Luis had left abruptly 6 months ago. According to his co-workers, Bernard had fired him without warning, accusing him of theft. But Luis's story didn't add up. Mia had tracked him down at a small diner on the edge of town, where he now worked long hours for half the pay. He had been hesitant to talk at first, but when Mia explained that she was looking into Bernard, his defenses crumbled. "He ruined my life," Luis had said, his voice shaking with anger. "I didn't steal anything. He just needed someone to blame, and I was an easy target." Luis had told her about the toxic environment at the restaurant, the way Bernard pitted employees against each other, making them too afraid to stand up for themselves. But he had also mentioned something else: rumors about a locked room in the basement, a place where Bernard kept files and documents he didn't want anyone to see. Mia hadn't been able to verify the existence of the room, but it was on her list. If there was a way to access it without blowing her cover, she'd find it. For now, she had to focus on the bigger picture. Bernard's network extended far beyond the restaurant, and the FBI needed a complete map before they could move in. As the night wore on, Mia drove back to her small apartment, a modest space she had rented to maintain her cover. She sat at her desk, poring over the evidence she had collected so far. Every piece of the puzzle brought her closer to understanding Bernard's operation, but there were still gaps, questions that needed answers. Why did Bernard operate so openly, as if he had nothing to hide? Was he truly that arrogant, or did he have someone protecting him from behind the scenes? And what about the investors who continued to pour money into his ventures despite the red flags? Mia knew the answers were out there, hidden beneath layers of deception, and as much as Bernard underestimated her, she wasn't about to underestimate him. He was dangerous, not just because of his wealth and connections, but because he had nothing to lose. The next day, Mia returned to La Bella Bistro, her uniform pressed and her expression neutral. Bernard barely acknowledged her presence, too busy entertaining a group of businessmen at his usual table. But as Mia moved through the dining room, she noticed something that made her pause. A man in a dark suit sat at the bar, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't a regular patron, his demeanor was too stiff, too calculated. Mia felt a flicker of unease. Had Bernard caught on to her investigation, or was this man another player in Bernard's game? She couldn't afford to make assumptions. For now, she would keep her distance, watching and waiting. But as the evening unfolded, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes were higher than she had realized. In Bernard's world, nothing was as it seemed, and the deeper Mia dug, the more dangerous it would become. The man at the bar stayed in Mia's peripheral vision throughout the night. He sipped a single drink, a neat whiskey, but barely touched it. His eyes moved slowly over the room, pausing occasionally on Bernard's table and the private dining room beyond it. Something about him set off alarms in Mia's mind. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that this wasn't just another customer. Bernard seemed completely unaware of the man's presence, laughing and gesturing animatedly as he spoke to the group of businessmen around him. They hung on his every word, their polished suits and expensive watches gleaming under the soft glow of the chandeliers. Mia couldn't hear the details of their conversation, but she recognized the telltale signs of another deal in progress, the quiet exchanges of documents, the subtle nods of agreement. Mia kept moving, clearing tables and refilling glasses as she worked the room. She couldn't afford to linger near Bernard for too long. His paranoia was as sharp as his temper. But she made a mental note of every interaction, every face. If these men were part of Bernard's network, she needed to know who they were. The man at the bar didn't stay long. After about an hour, he slid a few bills under his glass and stood, adjusting his suit jacket as he made his way to the door. As he passed Bernard's table, Mia noticed a brief moment of eye contact between them, so quick it might have been nothing. But the way Bernard's smile faltered, just for a second, told her it wasn't. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the careful balance Bernard had maintained was starting to crack. Back in her car, she replayed the scene in her mind, trying to piece together the connections. Was the man at the bar a rival, someone who threatened Bernard's operation, or was he an ally there to send a quiet message? The next day, Mia decided to dig deeper. She had a few hours before her shift, so she headed to the diner where Luis Morales worked. The morning rush had just ended, and the place was quiet when she walked in. Luis was behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. When he saw her, he offered a tired smile. "Back for more questions?" he asked, setting the rag aside. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the careful balance Bernard had maintained was starting to crack. Back in her car, she replayed the scene in her mind, trying to piece together the connections. Was the man at the bar a rival, someone who threatened Bernard's operation, or was he an ally, there to send a quiet message? The next day, Mia decided to dig deeper. She had a few hours before her shift, so she headed to the diner where Luis Morales worked. As she returned to the dining room, Bernard was at his usual table, but something about him seemed different. His usual bravado was muted, replaced by a strange sort of nervous energy. He sat with his back straight, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of his glass. The envelope she had overheard the staff whispering about was nowhere in sight, but Mia knew better than to think it had disappeared. Bernard wouldn't let something that important out of his reach. The man from the bar the previous night lingered in her thoughts. She still hadn't been able to figure out who he was or what his purpose was, but his presence had clearly unsettled Bernard. Whatever message he had delivered, it was enough to shift the entire dynamic in the restaurant. Bernard's usually unshakable confidence now seemed to hang by a thread. Mia's chance to observe him more closely came just after the dinner rush. Bernard left his table and retreated to his office, the door shutting firmly behind him. It wasn't unusual for him to disappear for long stretches, but tonight, the timing felt deliberate. The way he glanced over his shoulder before leaving suggested he was preparing for something. Mia seized the opportunity. She made her way to the kitchen, where the staff was busy cleaning up from the chaos of the evening. Keeping her movements casual, she slipped down the narrow hallway that led to Bernard's office. She didn't dare get too close, but she stopped just short of the door, pressing herself against the wall. Inside, she could hear his voice, low and tense. "I told you I don't want any more surprises," he said sharply. "I'm handling it." There was a pause, followed by muffled words that Mia couldn't make out. He was on the phone, and whoever was on the other end clearly wasn't happy. "I said I'm handling it," Bernard snapped. "You just make sure your end is covered." The conversation ended abruptly, the sharp click of the receiver echoing through the door. Mia barely had time to move before the door opened. She ducked into the shadows, holding her breath as Bernard stepped out. He didn't seem to notice her, his focus elsewhere as he walked briskly toward the dining room. Once he was out of sight, Mia crept closer to the office. The door was ajar, and inside, the desk was cluttered with papers. A single file folder sat on top of the stack, its contents partially spilling out. Mia's heart raced as she edged closer, but she knew better than to take the risk now. Bernard could return at any moment, and she couldn't afford to leave any trace of her presence. Instead, she memorized every detail she could: the placement of the folder, the faint imprint of numbers on the top sheet, the name Elliott Holdings scrawled in bold letters. She would need to look into it later, away from the watchful eyes of the restaurant. When she returned to the dining room, Bernard was back at his table, but his demeanor had changed again. He seemed calmer now, as though whatever phone call he had made had given him some measure of reassurance. Still, Mia could tell he wasn't entirely at ease. His eyes darted around the room, landing briefly on each staff member before moving on. The man at the bar the night before had done something to unsettle him, but the phone call had restored his confidence, at least for the moment. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the two events were connected. As the night wore on, Mia kept her focus on her tasks, but her mind was racing. She replayed Bernard's words in her head, trying to decipher their meaning. Who was he talking to? And what did he mean by handling it? Her thoughts were interrupted when Bernard called her over. She approached cautiously, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. "I need you to close tonight," he said without looking at her. "The others can go." Mia's heart sank. This wasn't a request, it was an order. Bernard rarely stayed late, and when he did, it was never a good sign. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral, and returned to the kitchen to relay the message. As the staff filtered out for the night, Mia felt the weight of Bernard's presence behind her. He wasn't watching her directly, but she could feel his eyes on her all the same. The restaurant was eerily quiet now, the hum of the refrigerators the only sound breaking the silence. Bernard disappeared into the back, and Mia took the opportunity to prepare for whatever was coming. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was the turning point, the moment where everything she had been working toward would either come together or fall apart. She adjusted the small recorder hidden in her apron, double-checking that it was secure. Whatever Bernard was planning, she needed to capture every detail. The tension in the air was almost suffocating as the minutes dragged on. When Bernard finally emerged, he was holding the envelope she had been so curious about. He set it on the table, his movements deliberate and measured. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Mia's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. She nodded and stepped closer, ready for whatever came next. But as Bernard opened his mouth to speak, the front door of the restaurant swung open, and a shadowy figure stepped inside. Bernard froze, his eyes widening as he took in the unexpected visitor. Mia turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Whoever this was, they had just changed everything. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, their silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of the restaurant's chandelier. It was the man from the bar, his sharp features now clearly visible as he scanned the room with calm authority. His presence sent a ripple of tension through the air, and for the first time that night, Bernard looked genuinely rattled. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Bernard said, his voice tight and laced with anger. The man smirked, unbothered by Bernard's tone. He walked further into the restaurant, his steps unhurried as he slid his hands into his pockets. "I thought we agreed on transparency, Bernard, but it seems you've been holding out on me." Mia froze, her mind racing. Transparency, holding out. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a rival or a disgruntled customer. He was connected to Bernard in a way that was deeper and more dangerous than she had imagined. Bernard straightened his posture, trying to regain his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said coolly, though his voice wavered ever so slightly. The man laughed softly, shaking his head. "Come on, Bernard. Let's not play games. I know about the offshore accounts, the missing funds. You think you can cut me out and I wouldn't notice." Mia's heart skipped a beat. Offshore accounts. Missing funds. This was more than just shady business deals. This was fraud on a massive scale. She glanced at the envelope on the table, realizing it likely held the evidence the man was talking about. Bernard's facade cracked further as he stepped closer to the man, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "And if you think you can come into my restaurant and threaten me—" "Threaten you?" The man interrupted, his tone sharp. "No, Bernard, this isn't a threat. This is a warning. If you don't fix this, you're going to have more than me to worry about. There are people watching you, and they're not as patient as I am." The words sent a chill down Mia's spine. The man wasn't bluffing. His confidence, his calm demeanor, all pointed to someone who had power and wasn't afraid to use it. Bernard, for all his bravado, was clearly out of his depth. As the confrontation escalated, Mia edged closer to the table, her movements careful and deliberate. She needed to stay invisible, but she also needed to hear every word. This was the break she had been waiting for, the piece of the puzzle that could bring Bernard down. The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Fix it, Bernard, or I will." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode toward the door. Bernard stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides as he watched the man leave. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Mia barely had time to process what had just happened before Bernard turned his attention to her. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment she thought he had caught her eavesdropping. "You," he barked, his voice cutting through the silence. "Lock up. Now." Mia nodded quickly, grabbing a cloth to wipe down the nearest table. Her mind was racing as she tried to piece together the new information. The man had mentioned offshore accounts and missing funds, evidence of corruption that went far beyond what she had uncovered so far. But what did he mean by people watching? As Bernard stormed back to his office, slamming the door behind him, Mia knew she didn't have much time. She needed to act before he destroyed the evidence or covered his tracks. She moved quickly, her pulse pounding as she grabbed her phone from her pocket. She typed a quick message to Agent Turner. There's more. Offshore accounts. Missing funds. Bernard might be working with someone dangerous. Need backup ASAP. Before she could hit send, the door to the office burst open again, and Bernard came storming out, his face flushed with anger. He was holding the envelope, his grip so tight it was crumpling the edges. I knew it, he muttered, his voice low but venomous. Someone's trying to set me up, but they won't get away with it. He stalked past her without another word, heading toward the basement stairs. Mia's stomach dropped as she realized where he was going. The locked room. This was her chance. If Bernard was heading down there, it meant he was about to either hide or retrieve something critical. But following him would be risky. If he caught her, it would all be over. She hesitated for a split second before making her decision. Slipping quietly across the dining room, she waited until Bernard was out of sight before following him down the stairs. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of cleaning supplies and damp concrete. She could hear Bernard muttering to himself as he unlocked the door at the far end of the hallway. She stayed hidden in the shadows, watching as he stepped inside. A faint light flickered on, illuminating the room for a brief moment before the door swung shut behind him. Mia crept closer, her footsteps silent against the cold floor. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear what was happening inside. Bernard was moving quickly, the sound of papers rustling and drawers opening and closing filling the air. Her heart pounded as she reached for her phone, ready to record whatever evidence she could. But before she could hit the button, a sudden noise behind her made her freeze. A voice, low and sharp, cut through the darkness. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Mia turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Standing behind her was a figure she hadn't seen before, a man dressed in all black, his expression unreadable. I don't know who you are, he said, his voice calm but threatening. But you're about to get yourself into a whole lot of trouble. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and Mia knew she was running out of time. Whatever was happening in that room, and whoever this man was, it was clear that Bernard's operation was bigger and more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. Mia's pulse raced as the man in black took a step closer, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. She could feel the tension crackling in the air, her mind scrambling for a way out. He hadn't identified her yet, at least, not as anything more than a curious waitress. She kept her voice calm and even, hiding the storm brewing inside. Look, I don't know what you're talking about, she said, raising her hands slightly in a gesture of surrender. I just heard some noise down here and thought I should check it out. The man didn't buy it. His lips curled into a faint smirk, but his posture remained guarded. You're not very good at lying, he said, his voice laced with amusement. But you're brave, I'll give you that. From behind the closed door, the sound of Bernard's frantic movements grew louder. Papers shuffled, drawers slammed shut, and then there was silence. The man in black seemed to sense the shift as well. His head tilted slightly, as though listening for a cue, and his hand moved toward his jacket. Mia knew she had seconds to act. Without thinking, she pressed the button on her hidden recorder, ensuring it captured whatever happened next. The man turned back to her, his expression hardening. You should leave, he said, his tone dropping. Right now. Before Mia could respond, the door to the locked room burst open, and Bernard emerged, clutching a small black briefcase. His eyes widened at the sight of the man in black, and for the first time, Bernard looked genuinely afraid. You, Bernard stammered, stepping back instinctively. What are you doing here? The man in black's smirk returned. Cleaning up your mess, Bernard. You've made a lot of enemies, but none of them as dangerous as me. Mia's heart pounded as she pieced it together. This wasn't just about the money or the offshore accounts. This was something far darker. The man in black wasn't a competitor or a lackey. He was a fixer, someone brought in to handle problems when things spiraled out of control. And Bernard, with all his arrogance and corruption, had pushed too far. The air grew heavy with tension as the two men stared each other down. Bernard clutched the briefcase tighter, his knuckles white as he tried to maintain his composure. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "I had to do it. If I hadn't—" "Save it," the man in black interrupted. "Your excuses mean nothing. The people you crossed don't care why you did it. They care about results. And right now, you're a liability." Maya realized this was her moment. She took a step forward, drawing their attention. "Enough," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. Both men turned to her, their expressions a mix of surprise and confusion. Mia reached into her pocket and pulled out her badge, holding it up for them to see. "FBI," she said, her voice steady. "This ends now." Bernard's face turned ashen, the blood draining from his cheeks. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. You're one of them." The man in black, however, didn't look shocked. Instead, he seemed amused, a low chuckle escaping his lips. Well, he said, folding his arms across his chest. "Looks like Bernard here has been playing in bigger leagues than I thought." Mia stepped closer, her eyes locking onto Bernard's. "You've been laundering money, hiding funds in offshore accounts, and working with dangerous people to cover your tracks," she said. "And now it's over. Drop the briefcase." Bernard hesitated, his mind clearly racing for a way out. But before he could move, the man in black spoke again. "I'd listen to her if I were you," he said, his tone almost mocking. "She's got the badge. And me? I'm just here to make sure you don't make things worse." Mia's heart pounded as Bernard slowly lowered the briefcase to the ground. He looked utterly defeated, his bravado stripped away to reveal the scared, desperate man beneath. But just as Mia reached for her radio to call for backup, the man in black made his move. With lightning speed, he grabbed the briefcase and bolted toward the stairs. Mia reacted instantly, chasing after him, her adrenaline propelling her forward. The chase was chaotic, the narrow stairwell echoing with the sound of their footsteps. As they burst into the dining room, Mia shouted, "Stop, FBI." The man in black didn't stop. He shoved a table aside, sending glasses crashing to the floor, and sprinted toward the exit. Mia pushed herself harder, determined not to let him escape. Just as he reached the door, another figure stepped into his path, Agent Turner. Turner's gun was drawn, his stance steady as he barked, "Freeze." The man in black skidded to a halt, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. He seemed to weigh his options, but ultimately he raised his hands in surrender. Turner moved quickly, securing the briefcase and placing the man in handcuffs. Mia caught her breath, her chest heaving, as she watched the scene unfold. Bernard, still in the basement, was apprehended moments later, his fate sealed. But as the dust settled, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man in black's calm demeanor, his willingness to surrender, it didn't add up. And then it hit her. The briefcase. Turner had it, but what if it wasn't the only one? Mia's eyes darted around the room, and she spotted it, a second briefcase, tucked behind the bar, identical to the first. The man in black noticed her realization and smirked. "You're good," he said quietly as Turner led him away. "But not good enough." Mia retrieved the second briefcase, opening it carefully. Inside, she found not money or documents, but something far more chilling. A list of names, each one tied to Bernard's operation, and at the top of the list was her alias. The twist hit her like a freight train. Bernard had known about her all along. He had been playing a dangerous game, feeding her just enough to keep her close while protecting the real operation. As the weight of the discovery settled over her, Mia realized the case was far from over. This was only the beginning. Mia stood in the center of the dining room, her pulse still racing as she processed the weight of her discovery. The list of names in the second briefcase wasn't just a lead. It was a treasure trove of information that could unravel an entire network of corruption and crime. But it also meant that Bernard and the man in black had been more calculated than she initially thought. They'd known about her, kept her close, and had played her as much as she'd been playing them. Turner approached, the first briefcase still in hand. "What's in that one?" he asked, nodding toward the second briefcase. Mia hesitated for a brief moment before opening it for him to see. His expression darkened as he scanned the names. "This changes everything," he said, his voice low. Mia nodded, her mind already racing through the possibilities. The names on the list weren't just random associates. They included powerful figures, some of whom were likely complicit in Bernard's schemes, while others might have been unwitting pawns. It was clear this case reached far beyond Bernard's restaurant and his shady dealings. It was a web that stretched into places she hadn't anticipated. Bernard, now in handcuffs, was being led out of the basement by two agents. His once cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated look. But as their eyes met, Mia saw a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Regret? Or perhaps the knowledge that, even in defeat, he'd left her with more questions than answers? Turner glanced at her. "We've got enough to take him down for good," he said. "But this list, it's going to open up a whole new investigation." Mia nodded, her focus sharpening. "Then we don't stop here," she said firmly. "We follow every lead, expose every connection. Bernard may have been the face of this operation, but he wasn't the mastermind." As the team secured the restaurant and began collecting evidence, Mia found herself stepping outside for a moment of air. The cool night breeze was a welcome relief after the chaos inside. She looked up at the stars, the weight of the night's events settling on her shoulders. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. Not yet. Turner joined her, his usual sharp demeanor softened by the shared exhaustion of the night. "You did good in there," he said. "You kept your cool, even when things got messy." Mia gave him a small smile. "It's not over yet," she said. "We've got the names, but we don't know how deep this goes." Turner nodded. "That's the job, though, isn't it? You pull one thread, and suddenly the whole thing unravels." Mia let out a quiet laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Yeah, but sometimes it feels like no matter how much you pull, there's always more." As they stood there, the door to the restaurant opened, and another agent stepped out. "We found something else," he said, his tone serious. "In Bernard's office." Mia and Turner exchanged a glance before heading back inside. In the office, the agent pointed to a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, they found a stack of documents and a collection of USB drives. Mia's heart sank as she realized what they'd uncovered. The documents detailed not just the financial schemes, but also blackmail material, photos, emails, and other compromising information on some of the names from the list. "This isn't just corruption," Turner said, his voice heavy. "This is leverage. Bernard wasn't just laundering money, he was controlling people." Mia scanned the files, her anger growing with every piece of evidence. Bernard had built his empire not just on greed, but on fear, exploiting vulnerabilities to keep people under his thumb. It was a reminder of why she'd joined the FBI in the first place, to dismantle systems like this, no matter how long it took. As the night stretched into morning, the team worked tirelessly to catalogue the evidence. Bernard and the man in black were transported to separate facilities for questioning, though Mia doubted they'd get much out of the latter. He was too calculated, too practiced at keeping secrets. Bernard, on the other hand, might crack under pressure. By the time the sun began to rise, Mia was sitting in a makeshift command center set up inside the restaurant. She stared at the list of names, her mind running through the possibilities. Each name represented a new lead, a new layer to uncover. But one name in particular stood out, a high-ranking official she'd never expected to see associated with something like this. Turner noticed her expression. "What is it?" he asked. Mia pointed to the name. "If this is legit," she said, "it means we're dealing with more than just financial crimes. This goes all the way to the top." Turner frowned. "You think they'll try to cover it up?" Mia shook her head. "Not if we move fast. We need to get this to the right people before anyone has a chance to bury it." It was a daunting task, but one Mia was ready to take on. The night had been a roller coaster of emotions: fear, anger, determination. But as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Bernard's arrest was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were making progress. As the team began packing up, Turner walked over to her. "You should get some rest," he said. "It's going to be a long few weeks." Mia smiled faintly. "I'll rest when this is over." Turner chuckled. "Somehow, I knew you'd say that." As she watched the last of the evidence being loaded into vehicles, Mia took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Bernard had tried to humiliate her, to undermine her, but in the end, he'd only fueled her determination. The restaurant stood empty now, a shell of the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. It was a fitting metaphor, Mia thought, for the operation they were dismantling: hollow, corrupt, and ultimately unsustainable. As she walked out into the morning light, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The journey was far from complete, but for now, it was enough to know they'd taken the first step.